Welcome, everybody. We're just getting a few minutes for everyone to get started here.
That link you to additional resources. So I'm going to do a quick topic overview for today's webinar. I'm going to be talking about reporting basics for these 3 grant programs, project progress and outcomes achieved reporting, a brief overview of reimbursement documentation, though you should get more detailed instruction on that in other webinars, the SDIF low-income tax mitigation reporting requirement, and finally, I'm going to do a little demo of a section of the Optis, the APR report that shows how you'll enter operating service data if that's required for your grant. Great. So again, this is for the SDIF discretionary and statewide transit network reporting. The statewide transit network program, if you'll recall, is both the STIF intercommunity discretionary fund as well as the 5311F fund combined. The majority of these reporting requirements are for all 3 of these fund sources, but there are some things that are only for STIF. So as was the case last cycle, the Stif, D, and Sdn reporting is still incorporated into the APR, which is your agency periodic report. And the information you'll enter that relates to project progress and outcomes achieved for your grant will be found in the grant information tab section of your APR, which is where you enter information for other grants that ODOT manages. funding under these programs is reimbursement based. So that means that reimbursement requests are only accepted for these grants following submittal of your quarterly APR. Vehicle purchases are an exception to that rule. The reporting requirements for these programs haven't shifted much from fiscal year 1921. So for most of you, it should be a refresher. But again, feel free to ask any questions you have. So the Stif administrative rules require recipients to report quarterly on 3 things for these programs. That includes expenditures, project progress, and outcomes achieved. And we'll get more into what each of those things are. The Stif and Sdn reporting structure, again, is part of the grant information tab where you report on other ODOT managed grants. Note that that's different from your reporting for Stif formula, which is done through the Stif periodic report or SPR. Now I'm going to dig in a little bit more for project progress and outcomes achieved reporting. So what is project progress? It's an update on the deliverables identified in your statement of work. So for project progress, we will be reviewing both the reimbursement requests to get a sense of which deliverables are being addressed and how far along the project is, as well as additional updates on deliverables, such as a bus was purchased would be an example. These updates provide RTCs with additional context, and apologies, that's regional transit coordinators that I will refer to as RTCs. So project progress reporting gives RTCs context as to the challenges that might be arising in project implementation and also what to expect in the coming quarters. Outcomes achieved, on the other hand, are the on-the-ground benefits of these projects and of the project progress being made. So they're the benefits to the public and to the transit network that result from project implementation. Like the project progress section, this is a narrative response, and it can also address any outcomes that were identified in the statement of work. Operation projects for this grant program are associated with a single service and thus can provide service data about that service in reporting. Recipients of operating funding and sometimes mobility management funding that's connected to a single service will be required to report on rides, revenue hours, revenue miles, contract revenue, fare revenue, other revenue for the service being funded, and all costs associated with the service. This is a reminder that reporting of service data is separate from where the APR requests ridership and other service data measures that are agency-wide. So there is a place in the APR where it asks for agency-wide numbers along these lines, and just note that that is still required and is separate from the Stif discretionary and Sdn specific requirement. We will take a closer look at the fields I'm referring to here later in the webinar. So moving on, I wanted to provide a great example from the last biennium of a project progress and outcomes achieved response that came from an APR of a recipient. And so you'll see here that in the project progress section, the recipient is talking about how the ridership levels have been affected by the pandemic, and also what they're doing to keep the route running, and also that there was an additional run that would be planned to be added July 1st, adding more options for passengers. So you'll note that that's project progress because it provides for that quarter, what's going on, how is the deliverable being addressed, and what has been done. And also you'll note that here the provider decided to also write about what was coming up. Now, as to the outcomes achieved section, they talk about the impacts of having an additional vehicle. They say by having access to this vehicle, we will be able to expand the service, providing additional connections to local and regional partners. And they also talk about the impact of the expansion. This expansion, combined with the rebranding of our transit services, will act as an excellent catalyst for ridership growth and program success. So you'll see there that they took the project progress piece and they turned it into an outcome. They said, what is the benefit? What is the benefit to the public from this project progress that we have achieved. And you'll note that, of course, things such as COVID-19 could have a significant impact on transportation services, including delays for the Stif funded projects as they're written in their statements of work. So it's great to see those updates as well, because it keeps the RTCs and other ODOT staff on track with where the project is and whether there could be any additional delays going forward. All right, moving on. So just a little bit more on outcomes achieved reporting. I wanted to give a little bit of guidance and help in thinking about the ways that you could respond to this requirement. So generally, outcomes achieved reporting should focus on the 6 SDIF selection criteria used during project selection. So those were the ones that appeared in the application that you responded to, and they also appear in program guidance. Those outcomes or those selection criteria are linked to Oregon Public Transportation Plan goals. And so those could be things like connectivity, accessibility for low-income communities, agency coordination, and ease of use of transit. So your outcomes achieved reporting should tie into the selection criteria. And by doing that, it also ties to the OPTP goals. For each quarter except the final quarter of the biennium, recipients should report on outcomes achieved during the preceding quarter. For the final report of the biennium, PTD asks recipients to reflect on the entire project period and share whether project goals were accomplished, and perhaps even how the recipient sees the program or service further evolving in future biennia. So when you'll answer for the final biennium in the same slot of the APR for outcomes achieved, but you'll give us a cumulative picture of the benefits and outcomes of the project rather than just for the quarter that you're in. You can get additional guidance on reporting on outcomes achieved through the supplemental guidance document, which has been shared separately with the providers and recipients, but will also be linked in this recording and can be found on the SDIF webpage. This supplemental guidance document identifies outcome topics of particular interest to Public Transportation Division and explains where those topics were drawn from. This and all other reporting resources are available on the Stif web page, as I said, and linked later in this presentation. Please reach out if you can't access them or can't find them. So I guess just another note on that supplemental guidance document. The prompts that it provides also provides example responses. So I think it's a really great place to go if you're stumped on kind of how you want to talk about outcomes achieved for your project. And of course, you don't have to follow those prompts. You certainly do not have to answer every question that is posed. It's just examples and guidance for you to work with when you're making these responses. I'm going to do here just a quick overview of what documents are attached with what reports to ODOT. So for the APR, you'll attach any civil rights complaints you have, DMV accident reports, and any additional documentation that was requested or required in the statement of work deliverables. So that's in your grant agreement itself. For example, a regional transit coordinator might have added additional required documentation for a planning grant if they wanted to get more quarter by quarter explanation of how the planning project is proceeding. For the reimbursement request, you'll attach any preventative maintenance worksheets or invoices you have, as well as other expense documentation. Reimbursement request resources, just another overview of those things. So there may be, again, additional documentation that would be required based on project type. And you can find at the link in the third bullet here, a breakdown of the expense documentation that's typically expected or required for different project types when you submit your reimbursement request. but other resources and guidance can be found at the office webpage, which I've also linked here. You should reference, as I said before, your statement of work for project-specific requirements that might have been listed in there by your RTC when the grant agreement was being written. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the annual SDIF low income mitigation report requirement. So this applies only to SDIF recipients. So for those of you that are recipients of 5311F or 5311, this does not apply to you. The due date for this annual report for the first one of the biennium, because there will be two, will be the November 15th, 2022 APR. And apologies, you will actually submit that with your fourth quarter SPR. I misspoke. So all SJF formula and discretionary providers, including non-formula recipients, will adhere to this date. So per the OARs, each QE receiving Stif funds is required to submit an annual Stif low-income tax mitigation report detailing any actions taken by PTSPs. So again, those are public transportation service providers located within the area of that QE to mitigate the impact of the SDIF tax on passengers who reside in low-income communities. So that's the description of the purpose of this requirement, and that is required through statute, and so it also appears in rule. Non-QE PTSPs must submit their low-income impact mitigation form to the appropriate QE at least 30 days prior to the deadline for the fourth quarterly SPR that is due on November 15th, 2022. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the process for submitting this special report. So the low-income mitigation form and supporting documents can be found on the Stif website and are linked in this presentation. And essentially what happens in this process is the QE collects a low-income mitigation form from each of the PTSPs that fall within its area of responsibility. There is a document that we have that's a PTSP guide that indicates those PTSPs that should report to a specific QE. If a QE is not listed on that guide, that means they don't have any PTSPs that need to report to them. And of course, if you see any errors within that guide, please reach out to us to make those corrections. So after the PTSPs send in all of their mitigation forms to the appropriate QE, the QE bundles those, completes their own form, completes a cover letter that is provided, and submits as an attachment to their SPR every fourth quarter. And of course, program staff and RTCs are available to answer any questions on this reporting requirement. Alrighty, so here's the part where I'm going to do a quick demo of that operating service data entry in Optis. Okay, so you should be now seeing an Optis screen. This is how the APR looks on my end. So you scroll down here to the grant information tab. And I did just randomly pick the Lane Council of Governments as an example since they had an operating grant last cycle. So what you'll see here is, of course, the grant agreement number and the name of the grant tied to the agreement that is being reported on. And so there's a separate one for each grant agreement number. These are all things that you know. We can skip this bar here that's talking about the amount paid out of the grant so far. Really what I want to show you is that for this grant, there's additional fields that are required. And in this case, it's ridership, revenue hours, revenue miles, service type, fare revenue, contract revenue, and other revenue associated with the service, and then also all costs associated with the service. And so that's nothing there is for compliance purposes. It's all just informational about how quarter to quarter the service is performing and changing. This next bar, starting with service revenue over here, this is actually automatically filled. The recipient does not fill out these sections. It's automatically filled based on the information that was provided in the above fields. So that's completely a tool for the recipients and not something that ODOT is using, but it provides the recipient an idea, for example, of the cost per revenue mile of the service. And then it combines the costs versus the revenue for the service to provide a net cost per ride for the provider. And they can also see how that will change from quarter to quarter. Since we're here, you'll also see that there's a section here on project progress and a section here on outcomes achieved that are narrative response fields. All right, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint now. So here's a page from which you can get to different guidance materials, including the reporting guidance, the supplemental guidance on outcomes achieved reporting, the low income impact mitigation form, and that PTSP reference guide that I referenced earlier. If you need help filling out the APR or you're having technical difficulties with it, you may contact your appropriate support analysts, which are listed here, as well as the regions that they're associated with. And for any content-related assistance, so you know what you might want to report under your project progress or outcomes achieved sections, you should contact your regional transit coordinator. Finally, there are also staff contacts here for myself and for David Graff, who's also intimately involved in the reporting process. So please reach out to us with any questions you might have. That is it. And thank you so much for watching. Please provide us with any questions you might have.
Okay, hopefully people can hear me. This is Patrick. David, I don't know how he's typing an answer to this question that I said I would answer live, but I accidentally said I'd answer it live. So for Megan Green's question about low income mitigation reports, that is, it is not a new requirement. It was included as a original part of the statute. So we can give another 30 seconds or so if anybody else has questions to raise on this half of the module, and then we'll get into the Stif formula piece.
Okay, did you answer the question for Miley Zhang? Is the Stif capital asset list in the other section also?
I would like a clarification on that, Miley, if you could type some more into the either Q&A or the chat? I'm not sure what you're asking there. I don't know if you have the ability to unmute them, Jamie, or not.
Yeah. No, she wrote, the reporting requirements indicate that the Stif capital asset list is to be included in the APR, but that was not addressed earlier.
Gotcha. Yes, that's just a general piece of the APR is that you inventory your assets and their condition and things like mileage quarterly. So that's just an aspect of the APR that predated the Stif program, but it is still relevant, yes. Hopefully that answers your question.
Katie Imes says, your slide said the mitigation report is due November 22nd, but then I heard the fourth quarter report. Which date is correct? Thanks.
So the low-income mitigation report is due with your fourth quarter SPR each year. And I believe that the first fourth quarter SPR will be due on November 15th of 2022 for the 21-23 biennium. For this past year, both of those reports were due in August. Hopefully that answers your question, Katie.
Mylance, is there a template for the Stif capital asset listing? There are some Stif assets that are not vehicles.
I welcome David Graff to jump in on this one. You know, this is really more of a question for our program services staff.
Sure thing. So for the STIF capital asset listing, we're using the Optis asset register for the purposes of the STIF capital assets. So any STIF funded assets, so whether that be a vehicle, signs and shelters, a facility, those should all be recorded in the Optis asset register as a PTD funded asset.
Let-
All right, Jamie and or Sean.
Let's go ahead and get moved on to
Yeah,
the next
exactly.
segment, which is going to be formula, Stif formula. Sean will get that going for us in just a moment.
These are the topics that will be covered in today's webinar. We'll start with a quick overview of the Stif formula program, then get into reporting requirements and roles and responsibilities of QEs versus PTSPs. Then David will get into compliance and consistency when it comes to Stif plan expenditures. And finally, we'll leave you with some resources and contact information. Today, we'll be talking about the Stif formula program, which makes up 90% of all Stif funding. Since it's a fairly new program, and I know there are differing levels of familiarity with it across the state, just want to cover two important definitions and their abbreviations before we begin. Qualified entities, or QEs, are defined as mass transit districts or transportation districts, Indian tribes, or counties. Public transportation service providers, or PTSPs, can be a QE or a city, special district, intergovernmental entity, or any other political subdivision or municipal or public corporation that provides public transportation services. We'll discuss the different roles and responsibilities that they each have later in the presentation. Lastly, Stif formula is not reimbursement based, meaning that you receive a disbursement at the start of each quarter, and then at the end of the quarter, you tell us how that money was spent. Let's go into a formula fund reporting overview. So outcomes for this program will be reported either quarterly or annually. This is just a quick overview of the different requirements. So on a quarterly basis, QEs will prepare and submit a report detailing project progress, outcomes, and expenditures. Annual reporting requirements include a report on low-income mitigation actions, a QE's annual budget, and results of any relevant financial audit of any QE and its PTSPs. Now let's take a closer look at quarterly reporting. QEs must submit their Stif plan report, or SPR, on a quarterly basis. The SPR has a similar design to the APR, but with Stif-specific items. This will be completed and submitted through Optis, or the Oregon Public Transit Information System. ODOT staff enter information from each Stif plan into Optis before the July 1 effective date so that it appears in the system like some of the other grant agreements you may have with us. In many instances, the information is pulled straight from your Stif plan onto the SPR, so small details about dollar amounts and outcome measures for each project are automatically generated onto your report. QEs will just need to provide updates on project status in this report and enter the amount spent in the expenditures field. A completed SPR will provide an overview of the entire planned Stif plan budget and remaining funding. Some of the outcomes you'll be reporting quarterly include revenue miles, hours, and rides, as well as information about transit connectivity with other providers and increased benefits to students in grades 9 through 12. You'll also need to provide information on any capital assets acquired, purchased, or leased throughout the quarter. Even though Stif formula is not reimbursement-based, we ask you to follow the expense documentation requirements that we have in place for our other grant programs. More information about these attachment requirements can be found on the Stif website under Quarterly Reporting Guidance. ODOT staff will track completion and consistency with Stif plan to determine compliance with approved Stif plan or failure to comply.
What this looks like on a reoccurring basis is laid out in the chart here on the slide. Disbursements are made to QEs at the beginning of each given quarter. Then we can see the quarter there includes the next 3 months, and then the QE STIF plan, or SPR, are due 45 days after the end of the quarter to ODOT.
Now let's talk about annual reporting. So the first item on this list is low-income mitigation reports. This is an overview of actions taken to mitigate the impact of the Stif tax on passengers who reside in low-income communities. The QE and all PTSPs on a Stif plan must complete a low-income mitigation form. The QE must also complete a low-income mitigation cover letter, then bundle this with all the forms received and submit it to ODOT on an annual basis. This should be attached to the quarter 4 and quarter 8 SPR in a biennium. Next on the list is the QE's annual budget, which is due to ODOT within 30 days of adoption. This is for the QE's budget only, so PTSPs do not have to submit this. This one is pretty straightforward. A copy of the budget should be submitted to ODOT's reporting inbox at the address provided on the screen. The last annual reporting requirement is the financial audit on Stif funds received. Since this one is a little more complicated, David is going to walk us through it in more detail.
So for the STIF annual financial audits, Any QE or PTSP located within the QE's area of responsibility must submit the result of any relevant financial audit. This includes all of the local, state, and federal audits, those under ORS 291-040, any reviews completed by the FTA, or any other type of information considered in a statewide audit. QEs are not expected to audit their subrecipients. Their role is limited to compliance oversight. Additionally, ODOT has developed the agreed upon audit procedures for recipients to follow as part of their minimum standards in the OAR, Chapter 162, Division 10. This guidance was updated recently in this June to include more specific items relevant to the audit.
Okay, to summarize some of the information we've just provided to you, let's talk about the difference in responsibilities between QEs and PTSPs. QEs are responsible for creating the SPR, collecting information from PTSPs to include in the report, and submitting the report to ODOT. They're also responsible for maintaining an updated capital asset inventory, bundling and submitting all low-income mitigation reports, and providing a copy of the annual adopted budget and any financial audit reports to ODOT. PTSPs are responsible for providing project updates to QEs on a quarterly basis, submitting the low-income mitigation form to their QE, maintaining an updated capital asset inventory, and providing copies of any relevant financial audits to ODOT.
Next, we're going to get into compliance and consistency. Here at ODOT, we're going to define these by example. The guiding principle behind this section is under OAR 732-042-0025, subsection 5E, that talks about the Oregon Transportation Commission can reject a Stif plan formula funding if the qualified entity failed to expend STIF formula funds in a manner that substantially complied with prior approved STIF plan. In this section, we're going to talk about what is consistent, what is inconsistent, and determining substantial compliance. So let's start off with consistent spending. The way we're going to define consistent spending is through shifting budget on the same types of activities across projects. Activities include, but are not limited to, capital purchases, program reserves, operation, planning, and administration of projects. Original projects must be carried out to the level planned prior to transferring unused fund. And then we would like an explanation for the shift in this funding. Here in example 1, we have unused vehicle purchases being transferred from project 1 to project 2 for additional vehicle purchases. Total funds can't exceed the budget of both projects combined. Additionally, ODOT is following FTA guidance where pre-approval would be required when the expenditure is greater than 10% of the total project cost or $250,000, whichever is less. Additionally, we'll consider budget shift or spending consistent with the STIF plan if it's transferred within the same project. So this would be transferring between different activity types within a project as per the little example here. We have those unused capital vehicle funds shifting to administration. Next, we have projects at close of a STIF plan period where the deliverables have not been completed or allowed to roll over to the next STIF plan period. We would want an explanation of any unfinished projects, what the hiccups were, and reasons for any delays. Carry forward and unspent funds can also roll over into the next STIF plan period, as well as program reserve spending. If you have a program reserve project, expenditures on those would just need a narrative provided on which existing planned projects were supplemented with the program reserve spending. Lastly, for consistent spending, we have debt payments made on projects and tasks specifically outlined in the STIF plan, and then delays in project spending within the STIF plan period. Be sure to ensure that at least 1% of total expenditures or of STIF dollars received support transportation for students in grades 9 through 12 in each fiscal year. Shifting budget between QEs and their subrecipient PTSPs, as well as between individual PTSPs on a QE STIF plan, are consistent, provided that there's concurrence between both of the providers in writing prior to the transfer. Next, we'll cover what is inconsistent spending with the STIF plan. First, going over your STIF plan budget total would be inconsistent. However, at the individual task and project level, you can go over budget, provided that the reason for going over budget meets the consistent spending procedures in the last section. Additionally, shifting between both activity type and project would be considered inconsistent. We can see here, we wouldn't want to shift from project 1, the extra capital vehicle funds, to project 2, task 3 for administration. It is going both across activity type and budget. Debt payments or payments made to debt payment projects that are not specifically described as debt financing in the STIF plan would also be considered inconsistent. Shifting both within tasks and between projects is also going to be considered inconsistent. Now, this is a little bit trickier. It is when we're doing both concurrently. So you can do across projects or within the same project, but not both. So we have this nice little diagram here where arrow 1 shows a shift between unused capital vehicle purchase or funds from project 1 to project 2. That transfers A-OK. Then later in the biennium, project 4 wanted to shift again some more unused capital vehicle funds from task 1 to task 3 administration. That's A-OK. And then we look at arrow 3 here, where project 1 has some additional administration budget and wants to shift that to project 4 in their administration budget. That would not be considered consistent, only because arrows or transfers 1 and 2 have already taken place. Arrow 3 in and of itself would be considered consistent if arrows 1 and 2 had not been done prior. Lastly, we're going to cover compliance. The 4 bullets here are really what are going to find a QE or PTSP out of compliance. Failure to complete one or more of the following actions will cause that non-compliance. At least 1% of STIF expenditures based on STIF funds received must be spent on supporting students in grades 9 through 12 in each fiscal year, if practicable, determined by the OTC. At least one project must benefit low-income households over the entire STIF plan period. All reports must be complete on time and over the STIF plan period, and documentation that supports STIF plan expenditures should be submitted with those reports. ODOT will identify compliance issues and work with the QE towards resolution with a compliance action plan. If there are 3 or more SPRs that indicate the QE has failed to substantially comply with its approved STIF plan, a remediation strategy will be required from the QE. Any ongoing compliance issues without a remediation strategy is a risk for the QE to have their next proposed STIF plan rejected by the PTS or by the OTC.
Thank you. Here are some resources and contact information related to the Stif formula fund.
All right, now we'll open it up to some additional Q&A for STIF formula or other general STIF questions.
Looks like a question came in. It says, can you address the Stif AUP?
Yes, so the AUP is part of the audit requirements for STIF formula QEs and PTSPs. So every fiscal year, the QEs and PTSPs should be auditing their STIF funds. And we do that through the AUP, which is the agreed upon audit procedures. There's a template on the STIF website. Is there anything more specific that you'd like me to address about the AUP? Yes, PTSPs are also required to submit the AUP to ODOT as well, and they should include the QE in that communication. Alternatively, depending on the QE-PTSP relationship, the PTSP can forward the AUP to the QE and the QE submit it to ODOT.
This is Maggie. I could talk about Peggy Green's question, which is if a PTSP does not complete any projects in a Stif formula biennium, what guidance could you give the QE for working with the PTSP in the new biennium? I think that regional transit coordinators could be a really great resource here, and just making sure that smaller milestones and goals are being achieved throughout the years. So I would suggest maybe setting up a meeting with the regional transit coordinator to talk about how to structure the projects for that biennium in a way that would, allow for you to be supportive and also just, make sure that the outcomes are being accomplished as you go along.
So for the question, QEs have a compliance role and they are not intended to audit the PTSPs. That is correct. QEs are not intended to audit their PTSPs. However, in the compliance role, that does allow them to do expenditure testing for SPRs and other submitted documentation for expenditures.
David, I could read you Kate's question. It's in your compliance project transfer slide. Could you have transferred between the second and third project on the admin tasks because you hadn't transferred money out? I was unclear if the number 3.1 wasn't allowed because of the previous vehicle fund transfer.
Yeah, it's either of them. So let's see, could we have transferred between the second and third project on the admin tasks? Because we hadn't transferred money out. Yeah, so either. So if we do the transfer one of the vehicle to vehicle, that kind of locks down project one. Alternatively, if we had just done arrow number 2, where the vehicle funds in project 4 go from the vehicle to the administration, that kind of locks down project 4, if that makes sense.
Cynthia asked if there are any changes in the Stif reporting forms this biennium compared to last biennium. I don't believe so. David, do you have anything you'd add here?
There will be minor tweaks to the SPR. we're trying to do a couple things to make it a little easier. For example, the program criteria, where you have the 7 areas of emphasis for STIF formula funding, are going to auto-complete with the value on the STIF plan. They're still changeable and editable, but we're putting whatever the value is on the Stif plan into that place. So if it's all A-OK and nothing's changed, you can just hit save and don't have to type in 0 for all but one of the criteria or whatever the criteria may be. So it will largely be the same, but there may be a few minor changes.
Okay, it looks like Miley has asked if we can address the QE subrecipient monitoring compliance guide. Sorry, David, I'm not sure that I have a good answer for this one. Are you able to talk about the subrecipient monitoring compliance guide?
Yes, there is a QE subrecipient monitoring compliance guide on the website. It outlines what steps the QE should be doing and should be responsible for as far as what areas in compliance that they should be looking at completing for their PTSPs. Does that address it well enough, Miley, or is there a more specific question?
Okay, well, we'll move on for now. Looks like David Conrad has asked if we would recommend reaching out to RTCs or other resources prior to moving funds around projects and tasks. I would say yes, RTCs are your great first contact, and then we usually, David and I will speak to them just to talk about the situation and make sure that it's something consistent with the Stif plan. But yeah, I would say that they're the first person you should contact. And then we also have another question that says, on one slide, you said going over budget total is not okay. However, over budget within task is okay. Can you clarify? Is that for the entire plan period or just the fiscal year?
Yes, I can clarify. So an individual task and an individual project can be over or under budget. The total STIF plan budget is for the entire plan period is what's not supposed to go over budget. Within a fiscal year, it's okay to be over or under so long as that entire biennium is within the budget.
There's a little follow-up question that asks, there still needs to be approval requested for shifting funds around. Is that correct? That is correct.
Okay. And does that take care of all the questions today? How does ODOT review the SPRs?
Internally, we have a checklist and various staff members from RTCs to myself and Maggie covers different areas and look for different particular items on the checklist. So I look at the backup documentation for expenditures and kind of do some quick math to see, okay, do your expenditures add up and do they look appropriate for what the expenditure is for? RTCs look for things like proper documentation to make sure that things like capital purchases can be entered into the capital asset register, and that other deliverables like mobility management are done according to their requirements.
The only other question I see is about what module 11 on specialty reporting is intended to cover next. So maybe Jamie or Sean can talk about that. But I think that's all we have for the Stif questions.
Yeah, I was happening to answer right now. It's going to cover specialty reporting such as like civil rights, Title VI. Then it's also going to go into some 5311 specialty reporting as well. Which it'll talk about NTD. I'm trying to think of all the different subjects it goes over, like, charter bus, things like that as well. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and shut this webinar down and prep for the next one. If you have any other questions, definitely reach out to Maggie or Patrick or David, and they'll be happy to assist you further. And then like every other module, we will be getting this posted to the training website shortly. Have a great day, everyone.